We're going to go back to the basics of costume construction or fashion construction and talk about sewing plain old seams. So if you are a beginning sewer of any kind, this will be helpful to you. I am using a Juki industrial machine, which many of you do not have at home. But if you're using a traditional home machine, the same rules apply. So I will be putting together these two sample little pieces, little rectangles. The seam that you are sewing may be of different sizes and lengths, but this is just to show you a plain, straight, regular old seam. How does that go together? So for demonstration purposes, I'm using muslin fabric. You can see it's just a simple cotton fabric here. I have marked the wrong sides of my fabric. So you can see there that I put W's on my fabric so that I knew my right from my wrong sides. That's really important in sewing. Many of our fabrics are going to have a very distinctive right and wrong side. It may have a print on the right side. It may have a very distinct texture on the right side, but there are quite a few fabrics out there that it is the same front to back. So you just have to pick a side and go with it. But for this demonstration, I've shown you the W's to make sure that I sew it correctly. So when putting our pieces of fabric together, it's important to note that if I'm sewing, say, these lines together, they should match up. Typically when we're sewing, we're cutting from patterns. You can see this here, that these lines are the same length. Typically when we're cutting from patterns, they are predetermined lengths and sizes that should theoretically match up. If you're cutting your own pieces, you do want to be conscious, obviously, that these lines that you intend to sew do in fact match. So when I begin to put this together, I'm going to match up the lines that I wish to sew like this. So I kind of sandwiched it together with my fingers, and notice that I have put them together right side to right side. So I am looking at the wrong sides of my fabric. So if I have a print, it will be hidden. It will be the peanut butter and jelly in the sandwich there. So I'm going to match those up. It's also important to make sure that you pin your lines well. It may be tempting in short, straight seams not to pin very much at all, but getting in the habit of pinning is very, very important when you sew. I like to pin perpendicular to this line that I'm sewing. So I'm actually sewing down this way, but I'm going to face my pins the opposite way. There are circumstances where you may change the orientation of your pins. In that case, should you ever move the pins to be down the line that you are sewing, you want to make sure you're able to pull the head of the pin out as you sew. If you sew on top of a pin, sometimes you can break a needle and or break or bend the pin, so you do want to avoid that. Notice that I've put my first pin a little bit into the fabric, but close to one end. Then I will go to the opposite end. And especially if you have a long pant or skirt piece, perhaps, this will be a very long distance, and you want to make sure you match up end to end first, always. Then you're going to find places in the center to pin. Again, if you have a great distance to cover, finding places in between to sort of divide and conquer this long length is important. Also, if you're using a traditional pattern, you may have notches on your fabric or markings that will help you match it up. So first you should pin end to end. Any notches that you have in between, if you don't have notches, find the center, find the quarters, and space out those pins accordingly. Then you want to pin in between. This is important to make sure that you pin in between. If you're not careful while you pin and you just throw a couple pins in the end, it's very easy for that back piece to kind of slip away from the edge. And as you run it through the machine, your seam allowance will not be consistent. You may think that you're sewing accurately, and you're sewing accurately on the side that you can see. You turn it over to the back and suddenly this has slipped away from the edge, and it is not in fact accurate at all. So do go ahead and pin carefully, making sure that these edges are still meeting as you're pinning. And again, if it is a shorter straight seam, you don't need a ton of pins. You can place pins every couple of inches or so, and that should be plenty, especially in a stable fabric like a simple cotton. Obviously, the trickier the fabrics, things that are slippery or stretchy are also going to be more difficult, and they're going to require more pins. So keep that in mind as your projects go on. All right, when I'm ready to sew, I'm turning on my machine, and there is quite a bit of noise from the industrial. Home machines obviously are not nearly as loud, but the industrial is more powerful, therefore it is loud. And I'm going to insert my fabric underneath my presser foot. The other thing I want to pay attention to is, where is my seam allowance? On many things, your seam allowance is already pre-designated in your patterns. They've already added additional fabric to this to allow for seam allowance. On the Juki industrial machine, it's marked every 1/4 of an inch. If you're using commercial patterns, most of the time your seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch. So you would actually place it in between the 1/2 inch and 3/4 inch line. But for this purpose, just to save me a little time and trouble, I'm going to move it over to the 1/2 inch line for demonstration. 1/2 inch is easy to find on a ruler and to mark for yourself, and also is a great line to follow on the industrial machine. So once I've gotten my orientation of my fabric, I want the edge of the fabric, the raw edge, to match up with this 1/2 inch line. I'm also going to make sure that it is placed slightly past where the needle will come down. You can see that I'm not on the very edge of the fabric, I'm just a little bit into the fabric there when the needle comes down. I'm going to start into the fabric and then backstitch backwards before I go forward. So this will allow me a little bit of space to do that. Also, I'm making sure that my presser foot is down as I am sewing. The presser foot helps keep your fabric in place. So depending on the machine you have, you may have a lever on the back of the machine that operates the presser foot. In the industrial that's built into a table, I actually have a knee lift, which is very convenient that I can do it hands-free. So do keep that in mind. So when I begin, presser foot is down, needle will be sunk. So I'm actually using the hand wheel on the side of the sewing machine with my right hand to reach over and rotate that needle so that it goes down into the fabric. I do this to begin to make sure that I'm not losing the little tail of thread. Occasionally when we start sewing fast very quickly and our needle is in the upward position, it can come unthreaded very, very easily as that rotates quickly. So if you sink your needle, you have much less chance of losing these important threads that you need. Okay, so now I'm ready to sew. I'm going to use my backstitch lever. So on your machine, it may be in different places. If you're using a home machine, but on an industrial sewing machine, there is a bar right there on the machine that I'm going to hold downward to go in reverse first. Then when I release, it will go forward. So I am controlling that as you watch. Let's get this back into position so you can see me sew. There we go. Okay, so I am holding the back stitch lever down. I'm going to go backward just a few stitches to the edge, so don't go fast yet. And once I've gotten to the edge, now I can go forward. So as I go forward and I'm sewing, I'm keeping my hands, especially my left hand, stabilizing this fabric. And I'm keeping an eye on my seam allowance line here, that I'm not shifting too far left or right over that seam allowance line as I sew. So keeping it as straight as possible. And I'm just stitching forward with the foot pedal. You can run over pins as long as you are careful in doing so. Occasionally you might bump into a pin, but often we can keep our pins in as we sew. And this time I'm going to sew all the way to the edge. So do so all the way to the edge. If you need the hand wheel to get you right at that edge, you can do that as well. You can slow down and use the hand wheel. And then I'm pushing the back stitch lever again, you can see that here, so that I back stitch at the very edge of my stitch. Tighten that back up. Sorry, my holder doesn't want to stay in place. Of course. Stay. Very professional. Okay, here we go. All right, now I'm ready to back stitch. So I'll back stitch a few stitches. You do not need to excessively back stitch. You don't need to zoom or go far. Just a few stitches when you back stitch is important. So now once I'm done, I want to make sure that my needle is out of my fabric. If the needle is still inserted in the fabric, I have to use the hand wheel and rotate that needle so that it comes above the fabric, lift my presser foot, and then pull away. And you can notice there's tension here, right? It doesn't want to pull away. That's because it's sort of mid-rotation in how the thread is catching in the machine. So all I have to do to loosen that, again, is to adjust my hand wheel. I got my left hand on my hand wheel, and I just rotate the needle a little bit until the thread becomes freer and it allows me to pull away from the machine. So I do make sure there's several inches of thread here before I snip and cut. This will leave me some tails of thread that let me get started on the next stitch. If I cut right next to the needle, the chances of the needle coming unthreaded and me needing to rethread the machine is very high. So cut away from the machine. And do make sure you trim these as close as you can get to the fabric so that you don't have hanging tails of thread on your project. Nobody likes that. It's sloppy, right? We're also going to remove our pins. We are done with our pins, and then we're going to go back to the original end that we started. We're also going to snip our threads there because, again, hanging tails are sloppy. Nobody wants to see hanging threads on a finished garment. All right, now my piece is sewn together. This is the right side, the front side, a nice, smooth, straight seam there. And these are the seam allowances on the wrong side of the fabric. I will next go to my iron and iron these seam allowances open. You want to press them open and flat, and I will have a separate video on pressing.